Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Flor Getty, and I represent the Youth Constituency Just Transition Working Group at the UNFCCC. And on behalf of the organizing committee, composed by Yongo, APMDD, Climate Action Network International, and the Women and Gender Constituency at the UNFCCC, we would like to welcome our distinguished experts, the panel, and all those joining us online to our event titled Towards BAM, the public hearings on the Just Transition Mechanism. So for the past few years, civil society has been engaging intensively on just transition at global climate conferences as a mean to ensure that all aspects of climate action embrace the need for securing justice for workers, indigenous people and communities, and really that can support all countries in their efforts to find a pathway for their people's prosperity. At COP30, so COP30 constituted a major landmark for advancing justice, equity, and rights through just transition. And a decision was taken outlining key principles that must be taken into account when advancing just transition. And on top of that, and critical to civil society demands, it committed to develop for decision in 2026 a just transition mechanism that will make all of those principles and aspects materialized. Our groups outlined several demands regarding the mechanism, which we have called BAM. So now it stands for the Belém and Playa Mechanism for Just Transition. And as we prepare for the next round of negotiations, we wanted to hear from experts and practitioners well beyond our constituencies to hear their thoughts on how we can make the just transition mechanism work, learning from past experiences and accelerating good work happening on the ground. And instead of holding those conversations privately, we have decided to hold them publicly and for the benefit of a much larger audience. So today with us, we have John Sward from the Bretton Woods Project. John Sward is the Environment Project Manager at the Bretton Woods Project, a UK-based World Bank and IMF watchdog. John joined the project in August 2017 and oversees its climate and environment advocacy, which aims to challenge how the policies of the World Bank and IMF shape countries' ability to respond to the climate crisis. He holds a PhD from the University of Sussex. So how we're going to do this, we're going to hear a presentation from our expert, followed by an interactive exchange with representatives from civil society. Today we have in the panel Maggie from the Women and Gender Constituency and Amira from CAN and Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. So without further ado, John, over to you. Thank you so much for being here.
That's great. Thank you for the kind invitation. Yes, as mentioned, my name is John Sward. I work at the Bretton Woods Project. And so I'm going to be trying to bring a kind of perspective on the Bretton Woods institutions, that is the World Bank and IMF, how they have been interfacing with UNFCCC process and some of the kind of implications of their current policy on the energy sector that I think will be useful to keep in mind as the process for developing the just transition mechanism proceeds this year. So hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes.
So just to start out with a little bit of level setting from the point of view of following the evolution of the new global climate finance goal from an MDB's perspective, I think unfortunately what we've seen is the growing prominence of MDBs within the space, right? And really following the very disappointing NCQG, MDB finance is almost a sort of core pillar of really existing climate finance. And in particular at the World Bank, we've seen its reported climate finance totals grow really exponentially over the past decade, reaching over 50 billion in fiscal year 2025. Only around 9% of this is grant-based finance. That's all in the World Bank's low-income country lending arm, known as IDA. And I think, contextualizing this bigger discussion, it's fair to question whether this type of finance is aligned with a polluter pays principle. Um, a lot of the MDB's financing model relies on loan repayments from low and middle income countries with interest to fund their operations. And there's also questions about transparency and the sort of greenwashing of business as usual as part of this accounting. And so beyond financing, um, the Bretton Woods institutions also play a sort of increasing role as norm shapers, I would say, in the bigger sort of climate finance space, but also in thinking about energy transitions. And so there's, in case people are not aware, there's a very complicated history of the relationship between the World Bank and IMF and the UN in general. They were both created as specialized agencies of the UN, but have distinct mandates and do not necessarily align with other things within the UN space, and human rights being a famous example of this. So the bank and fund are not parties to the UNFCCC, but in a way they're interacting with this space in more increasingly deep and sort of profound ways. One of the ways in which this is happening is through the MDBs are all undergoing this process of aligning their activities with the Paris Agreement by a screening process that's meant to show alignment with countries' NDCs. And we've seen this already sort of shaping a kind of like normative understanding of what Paris alignment means. The World Bank started this process for all its public lending to governments in June of 2023. At the same time, in the current World Bank Climate Change Action Plan, there's a very limited understanding of just transition in that document, really focused primarily on communities affected by coal mining phase out. The IMF is a sort of different case where they're primarily the lender of last resort for countries who are having difficulty in servicing their sovereign debt. And so for a number of decades, climate was seen as kind of like outside the core mandate of the IMF. That really changed in 2021 when the IMF launched its first climate strategy. But unlike the MDBs, the IMF has no sort of Paris alignment process. And I think that's especially relevant for core IMF lending programs, where still, even after the climate strategy, a lot of what the IMF would consider debt sustainability, in other words, countries' abilities to service their external debt, may be based on new fossil fuel extraction. There's a number of examples of that following the climate strategy. The IMF also set up a new lending facility in 2022 called the Resilience and Sustainability Trust, which has a mandate to help members address future balance of payments issues and that's related to debt sustainability issues ultimately um, that are related to prospective impacts of climate change that provides concessional loan financing and is really the first time that the IMF has done any sort of like lending that's related to climate. This is now under attack from the US. There's a question of that fund ultimately being wound down. And I think the last kind of contextual point to note is both of these institutions really favor the approach of trying to mobilize private climate finance via de-risking green projects. And this in particular has been a priority of the World Bank. So to sort of ground, I've been talking so far at a very kind of like top line, high level to sort of ground this in a way that I think would be useful for the discussions around the just transition mechanism. I'll just spend a few moments talking about what is a relatively obscure area of World Bank lending, which is its policy-based lending instrument known as development policy financing. So this is non-earmarked budget support, either loans or grants. In other words, just a budget loan. Um, and there's a pretty wide parameter of what countries can spend that financing on. So it doesn't have to go towards any climate or energy related projects, but it's tied to specific conditionality that has to be agreed between the World Bank and governments. And in this instrument, there's no requirement for public consultation. It sometimes does occur if there's like specific communities or stakeholders that can be identified, but there's no requirement to do that. And so one of the things we've been looking at in the past couple of years is trying to get a better and more holistic understanding of what the World Bank is conditioning countries to do in this instrument in the energy sector. And so you can see in this graphic here, in the sort of 6 years, fiscal year 2018 to fiscal year 2023, this was quite a common prior actions just refer to conditions that are included in DPF loans that were agreed. So there were 258 conditions in 60 countries. And so what does this mean, practically speaking? Since the 1990s, since the era of structural adjustment, really, the World Bank has been promoting a certain type of energy sector reform that is rooted in this theory of change that countries need to move away from inefficient state-owned enterprises in the energy sector. They need to privatize, liberalize, and marketize their energy systems. And so that kind of theory of change is laid out in the graphic. This is from the World Bank's own sort of like understanding of how this model is meant to work. And ultimately, it's justified by this notion that this is going to deliver better results for people on the ground. But the bank's own research in terms of how this reform blueprint has been implemented really shows mixed results in practice. And the side effects can include higher energy costs, unexpected additional costs for governments, and having to fulfill contracts with private producers, where often they need to pay for a certain amount of energy, whether it's being used or not. And there is some evidence in the sort of systematic reviews of evidence that have been undertaken by academics that the so-called efficiencies of this model are typically captured by the private sector rather than being passed on to the public at large, as the theory of change sort of promoted by the bank would suggest. And so what we're seeing in the energy sector conditionality in more recent years is that an argument being made by the bank that this approach that was being used in the 1990s can now be pivoted to support a green energy transition. And so this graphic here shows, again, the bank's sort of understanding of the strategy here and how this might happen. And so the support for regulatory and policy environment, that is the kind of piece of this that would come through the World Bank's policy-based financing conditions. And this approach has been applied by the World Bank in some of the JETPs, for example, in South Africa and Indonesia. So it's a very kind of like top-down uh, model to the energy transition. And perhaps to add insult to injury, a number of these conditions are being counted by the World Bank as climate finance. And so this is on the basis that the conditions are having like a pro-climate catalytic impact. Through an access to information request that we filed in 2024, for the first time we were able to see, we knew that a lot of development policy financing was being counted towards the World Bank's climate finance totals, but we didn't know which specific conditions or prior actions were being counted. And so we were able to figure that out for this data set. And about 70% of all the energy policies and reforms were classified as having climate co-benefits, which means they count towards the World Bank climate finance total. So that was 7.6 billion in total was counted as climate finance in those years. And that this bucket of financing is continuing to rise. And so this figure provides a kind of like overview of what types of conditions were counted as climate finance. And a lot of it is largely an extension of this existing reform agenda, with a few exceptions, obviously. So within that, there was quite the most common condition was a heavy focus on fuel subsidy removal, but this doesn't address producer side subsidies, really only consumer subsidies, with one or two exceptions is what we found in the data set. And so, of course, this can have the kind of dual impact of raising energy prices for citizens in these countries, but also in the context of global climate justice sort of debates. You could, looking at these countries that are highlighted, they have a fairly marginal contribution to global greenhouse gas emissions, et cetera. And indeed, it's really unclear in many of the countries that we've looked at that this is having a sort of impact on reducing even national emissions, this type of policy. So yeah, maybe to draw this bit of the discussion to a close. Yeah, one of the things we've been advocating for is like a much better process for trying to understand the impact of the reforms that are being promoted by the World Bank through this type of lending. Uh, the bank's sort of discourse is that all these uh, reforms are country-led. That's how it's kind of like mentioned in public discourse. But of course, a lot of them are nearly identical. So that's a kind of like well, that shows that a certain set of policies are being discussed within this framework. But I think more importantly for this discussion, our feeling is that there's very little visibility of this reform process, even in amongst sort of like energy specialists within given countries. A lot of people simply are unaware that this kind of like back end of energy policy reform is taking place. And so there's clearly a need for like a much broader and more inclusive process around articulating what a just transition is at country level. So, coming from the perspective of working on this area of policy in particular, this is, I think, one contribution that a just transition mechanism could make is sort of providing a mandate for a much more robust and inclusive discussion. And maybe that can be the reference point that the IFIs kind of like have to refer back to in their own operations. So perhaps I'll pause it there for now.
Thank you so much, John, for your presentation and for giving so many very interesting detail on the top-down model to the energy transition and the example that you gave around the energy prices rising and the need for a better process to understand the impact of reform. And thank you for the key recommendations, also outlining how a mechanism would need a mandate for a more robust and inclusive discussion. I think probably Maggie and Amir, you have many questions or even feedback on what you've just heard. So why not we take a first round of questions? And maybe I can also ask a question. How could the mechanism be used to really change the way in which the banks are dealing with just transition? That would be a question I'd like to ask and pass it on to Maggie, and then Amira, you can ask just after.
Thank you, Flore, and thank you, John, for your presentation, which was very interesting and illuminating about the role of IFIs. I think maybe going into like the specificity of the development of the just transition mechanism. I think something that I wanted to ask you, you started speaking a bit about the role of IFIs within the UNFCCC. So I think like something that I personally would find interesting would be what are lessons learned that as a civil society and stakeholders could bring into the development of the mechanism to maybe, I don't know if curve the effect of IFIs in the development of energy policy. Also, what could we expect that their involvement would be, and somehow which are key stakeholders that should also have an important level of engagement and participation within the mechanism to also have an impact in the development of policy and counteract, let's say, to the typical policies that have been advanced by IFIs. And for now, I'll leave it at that and I'll pass it to Amira.
Thank you so much. Obviously, the Just Transition decision text included quite a lot of useful kind of references for the first time related to, structural inequalities in the macroeconomy and how they're, preventing just transition from happening. But obviously, as you're describing, and many of us are kind of fairly familiar with, like the IFIs do not operate within a just lens. So what can we be advocating for? Is there anything specific that we can be advocating for or building awareness about with regards to perhaps even guardrails towards the IFIs in terms of how much they can even get involved with or dictate the terms of the BAM when we actually know that they are not operating within a justice lens? So, those issues that come up within the decision text around debt, around access to finance, capital costs, and has not been resolved by the current IFI institutions. And that's why there's obviously this mobilization out there for IFI reform. So they shouldn't therefore have unbridled input and influence over a just transition mechanism. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on specifics that we should be advocating for, raising awareness about. Thanks.
Yeah, those are all excellent questions. I'll try to sort of give some thoughts. I think, looking at both the IFIs and the UNFCCC process, one kind of like red thread that flows through that is IFIs are ultimately owned by shareholders, right? And so, to the extent that the World Bank and other MDBs have grown their climate finance reporting, that's also been something that's been pushed pre-Trump anyway by the G7. So it's not only the IFIs aren't working in a kind of like vacuum, right? The governments who ultimately own them are kind of like giving them a steer on what they want them to do on all of these issues, including climate. So I think yeah, that's where part of the opportunity lies in terms of the just transition being able to articulate a very like clear vision of what the just transition means, and then using that in terms of shareholder advocacy to demand that the shareholders implement this at the IFIs is one route to impact. So yeah, I think in terms of the question of how the mechanism can be used to change the way the banks deal with a just transition is just to have a sort of like super clear, like, and I think that's the goal, the ultimate goal, right? Is to consolidate this very fragmented kind of like set of processes, but also definitions around what the just transition means. I think to have a very clear bottom-up understanding of what this should be would act as a kind of like barrier to the kind of JET-P model continuing to be like promoted as this is how we do just transition. So I think, you know, this is a clear opportunity for those of us who work in the IFI space in terms of what the just transition mechanism can achieve is that there'll hopefully be something that we can point to outside the IFI space that should be like guiding what they do and allow us to critique their approach. I think the other opportunity is that there's quite a lot of discussion in the ongoing IFI reform debates around country ownership. And so, yeah, for me, that's another opportunity in terms of how to sort of like either change the way in which the IFIs sort of interface with this issue, or kind of mitigate the current approach. So what does country ownership mean in the context of this like obscure instrument I was just speaking about? Country ownership is quite shallow. It's like normally these reforms are just agreed between the World Bank team and ministers, usually in a closed room. Like the public at large doesn't have a good understanding on what's being negotiated. And that's a kind of like weakness of the instrument, but also why some people remain in favor of it is a kind of like also a way of quickly dispersing financing. So I think, yeah, having a very clear definition about what like country ownership is in the context of the just transition would also be helpful for that reason. I think some lessons learned of the whole process of Paris alignment at the MDBs, which was not a foregone conclusion, right? And the US and other chairs now are once again like completely against like all of this agenda and just want the MDBs to go back to financing fossil fuel projects, for example. But yeah, I think one of the lessons of that process was actually that civil society does have a pretty large voice in shaping the perceptions of what the IFIs are doing in the media and elsewhere. And so, yeah, I think, again, for that reason, like if the just transition mechanism can sort of live up to a lot of that language that was in this decision text, I think it will like matter, even though you know, the MDBs, generally speaking, and the World Bank and IMF in particular, want to like create their own standards, their own kind of like norms. Like they don't want to copy and paste from UN space into what they do necessarily. And I think the IMF is is the most averse to that of kind of like all the IFIs. So yeah, there is going to be a kind of like push and pull here in terms of the sort of like governance question about what the just transition means. But yeah, for me, that's the sort of opportunity. And yeah, I think, you know, the Paris alignment process has also shown that there's kind of like benefits, but also trade-offs of the IFIs like coming into the space, right? It's meant like materially speaking that they have financed many fewer fossil fuel projects than they probably otherwise would have, for example. So it's not like all sort of bad news. Obviously, I was just presenting like one kind of like case study, but I think, given the rise of MDB, climate finance, etc., it's just an issue that can't be sort of wished away, that has to be sort of navigated as part of these processes, I would say. Maybe I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you so much. Maggie or Amira, do you want to react or follow up? Yes.
Yeah, maybe. Thank you, John, for your comments on these questions. I was sort of like thinking in the broader reform of the UN that we are seeing with UNAT and the shrinking, let's say, of multilateral spaces. What do you anticipate the role of IFIs will start to become in the coming years, and how could that be integrated into the UNFCCC and specifically maybe into a new structure like the BAM, but in general, what do you think are the trends with the UN reform for IFIs? Do you think that there will be momentum for change, or rather a broader role for them, but in the same terms as we have currently been seeing?
Will I follow up now or let John answer? Yeah, I'll let you answer and then I'll come back with my question. Thanks.
Yeah, I think, well, who among us would try to predict the future of geopolitics at this point? But certainly, I think what we've seen is a clear bifurcation of in the US, but not only the US position in how they're engaging with the UN and the IFIs. So you may be aware that last February, the Trump administration did initiate this executive order that reviewed US involvement in all international organizations. And so because this conservative manifesto called Project 2025 did have this this line about the US potentially leaving the World Bank and IMF, that it was no longer in the US's interests to be part of these institutions that they've largely been the sort of primary beneficiary of in the last 80 years. There was this question about the administration's approach to the bank and fund and IFIs generally. I think where that review had sort of landed, and this was announced quietly at the start of this year, is that if anything, the US is trying to reassert itself at the bank and fund and has announced the supposed withdrawal of its involvement in a number of UN departments, basically, and other international organizations. Obviously, the UNFCCC is included in this. So yeah, I think you have this kind of like split in terms of that piece of it. A real question, like not only in terms of the US paying its dues to the UN, but a number of countries, right? So I think in terms of the IFIs and climate, it's a bit unclear the direction of travel. Like some of the work is continuing, but at the same time, on climate specifically, but at the same time, like in the spring and annual meetings last year, there were no flagship events on climate. This sort of public convening role that the IFIs like to play on climate has been vastly reduced compared to previous years. So it's a bit of an unknown. I think, of course, the MDBs are still present in the COP space. I'm sure, they'll be involved somehow in whatever comes out of BAM, I would guess. But this is a bit of an unknown. I think, like, on both boards, and it came out, like Reuters reported on this, that 19 of the 25 World Bank executive directors are still in favor of the World Bank continuing its climate work, etc. So there's a sort of like silent majority, you could say, that's in favor of this work continuing, but at the same time, I think historically speaking, the way that the World Bank has raised money is for shareholders to pay in more capital every 5 or 10 years. And that process is usually linked to like a set of policy priorities. And so having any kind of capital increase that's premised on climate while the current US administration is there will not happen. Clearly. So I think there's a lot of questions in terms of the sort of short to medium term future, but certainly from the point of view of their resources, I think the balance sheets of the IFIs are in pretty rude health. Like they have a different operational model than the UN does, right? So they're able to like issue bonds and raise capital on markets. Like they have a lot more flexibility in terms of their financing than the pretty like outdated system we have for running the UN. So yeah, taken all of those factors taken together, mean that I think, you know, there's no question they'll continue to play a big role. I think in terms of the grant financing, there's no way for the MDBs to magic up more grant financing without more paid in capital in terms of like their operational model. So maybe that's like one thing to point to in terms of the direction of travel is, you know, there's a massive structural scarcity of grant financing in the system already. And so like where would that piece come from? And the MDBs are not well suited to provide it without significant changes to how they operate, basically.
You sort of answered the question that I had, but I'm just going to press you a little bit on this challenge that you're really highlighting about to what extent IFIs should be in the room in the context of the just transition mechanism, or to what extent, as you were saying, like country ownership should define the contours, or the regulations nationally should define how countries engage with them. I guess what I'm pushing for is some sense of what we should be considering in terms of our demands and advocacy to ensure that we're taking into account the very tricky context that you mentioned of where the IFIs are, but also the fact that, yeah, like if they're not in the room, like we've seen with there's been some normative shift in terms of how they operate because they've been in the room around Paris. So in the coming months, even if you don't have like a specific thought now, is there a way we can start to think together about what we should be ensuring is on the table, or, you know, with regards to how they engage and how they shouldn't engage, that we can be advocating for? And sorry to push you again on that.
Yeah, I think one thing that needs highlighting in this process, and that I possibly should have mentioned in the first answer, is, you know, the role of unions and decent work generally. So the pivot away from climate has meant at the World Bank that they're almost exclusively talking about jobs now. The agenda is all about jobs. But at the same time, they don't actually have like a great metric to measure their impact on jobs, and it's not about decent work, really. So yeah, I think that's where there could be like there's quite a large opportunity, especially given that's a sort of judo move of taking the momentum of like what all the public narrative and discourse is about at the moment is really like focused on the jobs agenda, and ITUC and others are engaging or trying to engage with the bank on that. So yeah, I think as well in terms of the sort of like one of the inspirations for our work on the policy-based lending side was the kind of critique that Trade Unions for Energy Democracy had of the bank's privatization agenda. So, you know, they put out a couple statements at recent COPs, like covering a pretty wide range of issues, but specifically calling out this type of approach. And of course, like the entire structural adjustment agenda was pretty like anti-union, and a lot of the conditions still are, right? Like working to undercut good union jobs and like in the energy sector. So that's like definitely one of the trickier issues to navigate, but I think like it obviously is essential to this entire question. I think, you know, it's ultimately, as I mentioned, I think the IFIs will be involved somehow. Like even if they're not in the room, they're still going to be shaping the broader context in which just transitions are being financed or could occur, right? And so yeah, for us, it's also about like the ability to open the discussion out and not just be so like not just have tunnel vision about one possible energy transition or one possible energy future in any given country, right? So the emphasis on on things that fall outside that model, which if you have a model that's basically based only on creating an investable project pipeline that private capital can come invest in as an asset class, that forecloses a lot of possible other energy transitions that might be potentially workable in like any number of countries, right? And so, yeah, I think something that would be useful is, you know, being able to kind of like articulate at the country level a critique or point out some of the trade-offs of this approach. I think one of the frustrations about specifically like what I presented on is there's so little sunlight on the process. And so yeah, it's kind of antithetical to the notion of having a more like broad-based inclusive process. And ultimately can, I mean, I think where it's been most damaging is it contributes to this like general despair in the kind of like that we see everywhere from top-down politics where people don't feel like decisions are being made without their input or well-being in mind, right? So yeah, I think there is an opportunity there to I mean, we've had a lot of exchanges with the bank about this, and they just feel, you know, to your point, they do feel that this is like the most strategic way to to crowd in financing for the green transition in these countries. So there's, I think, like part of it is about having like a discourse, but there's also maybe a need for like you know, economic and other policy experts to be saying, actually, alternative ways of doing things are viable. And like, here's a proof of concept. Like, these are other models that can be pursued, and like, and that will vary, I think, a lot depending on the country, right?
Thank you so much. Super comprehensive and learning a lot from you. So I appreciate it.
Excellent. Thank you so much. A lot of food for thoughts, I think. I also learned a lot. So thank you so much again. I think we'll wrap up now. So thank you, John, for your presentation. Thank you again, Mari and Maggie and Amira for being our panelists and asking insightful questions. We'll close the live now. Thank you.